The emergency klaxons had been screaming for 3 minutes when David Rivers felt his ship tear apart around him. Metal groaned and twisted as the reconnaissance vessel plummeted through Valdris Prime's hostile atmosphere. He gripped his command chair while sparks erupted from every console and the artificial gravity flickered between normal and zero. His crew was already gone. The first impact had thrown Lieutenant Adams through a bulkhead with a sickening crack. Ensign Torres had disappeared. When the port side of the ship simply vanished in a shower of debris and fire. Now David was alone with nothing but the smell of burning electronics and the terrible knowledge that his mission to scout this distant world had become a death trap. The ship hit the crimson sand with the force of a falling mountain. David's restraint snapped and he flew forward into darkness. Heat woke him, brutal, dry heat that made his throat feel like sandpaper. The sun of Valdris Prime blazed overhead like an angry eye, and the twisted wreckage of his ship stretched across red dunes that seemed to go on forever. His left arm hung useless at his side and blood had dried across his forehead. But he was breathing. David crawled through the scattered debris looking for anything useful. His sidearm had survived the crash along with a basic medical kit and what remained of his field rations. The communication array was a melted ruin and the emergency beacon had been crushed beyond repair. Nobody in the Earth colonial fleet even knew where he was. That was when he heard the sound dot. It started as a low rumble that seemed to come from the sand itself. David looked up to see shapes moving across the dunes in the distance. At first he thought they might be some kind of desert animals, but as they came closer he realized they were vehicles. Strange, angular machines that hovered a few feet above the ground and moved with purpose toward his crash site. David grabbed his weapon and found what cover he could behind a section of hull plating. The vehicles were clearly alien in design. All sharp edges and metallic surfaces that gleamed in the harsh sunlight. As they approached, he could see figures inside them. Tall figures with too many arms. The first vehicle stopped just outside the debris field and its occupants stepped out. David had to force himself not to stare. They were unlike anything he had ever imagined. 8 feet tall with bodies covered in natural armor that looked like polished beetle shells. 4 arms extended from their torsos and their heads were elongated with mandibles that clicked when they moved. Their eyes were large and multifaceted, designed for a world where predators could come from any direction. One of them pointed at the wreckage and made a series of clicking sounds that must have been speech. The others spread out with practiced military precision, clearly searching for survivors. David knew his hiding spot would not fool them for long. When they found him, David had his weapon ready but did not fire. 3 of the creatures surrounded his position while the others watched from a distance. The largest one, distinguished by elaborate markings carved into its natural armor, stepped forward and studied David with obvious curiosity. David tried to speak but only managed a hoarse croak. The alien leader tilted its head and made more clicking sounds. Then it reached out with one of its 4 arms and easily knocked the weapon from David's grip. The strength in that casual gesture was terrifying. They bound his hands with some kind of metallic cable that adjusted itself to fit perfectly around his wrists. David did not resist. Even healthy, he would have been no match for one of these creatures, and with his injuries he was completely helpless. The alien leader examined David's uniform and equipment with professional interest, turning over his sidearm and field gear like a collector studying interesting artifacts. The creatures loaded David into one of their vehicles and began the journey across the desert. Through the transparent sections of the craft, David could see more of Valdris Prime's landscape. The red sand gave way to rocky outcroppings and then to what looked like cultivated areas where strange plants grew in geometric patterns. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the orange sky as they traveled. David forced himself to observe everything. The vehicle's controls were clearly designed for 4-armed operators, and the symbols on various displays suggested a sophisticated technological base. The aliens themselves moved with the disciplined coordination of military personnel. Their equipment was well maintained, and their behavior suggested a highly organized society. One of his captors noticed David's attention and made clicking sounds that might have been amusement. It gestured toward David and then toward itself, as if trying to establish some form of communication. David nodded slowly, and the alien repeated the gesture. They were trying to be friendly, or at least not immediately hostile. The journey took several hours and ended at something that took David's breath away. Rising from the desert floor was a massive fortress city that seemed to be carved from the living rock of a huge mesa. Towers and walls stretched up toward the sky in defiance of gravity itself. Landing platforms jutted out from the structure. At various levels where similar vehicles came and went like busy insects as their transport approached one of the landing platforms, David could see hundreds of the aliens moving about their business. Some wore the same kind of armor as his captors, while others were dressed in what looked like civilian clothing. Children, if that was the right word, played in areas that might have been parks or gardens. This was not just a military installation, but a functioning city. The vehicle landed with barely a bump and David was escorted out onto the platform. The gravity on Valdris Prime was slightly heavier than Earth normal, and the thin air made breathing difficult, but David was able to walk without assistance. His captors formed a loose escort around him as they moved through corridors carved from solid stone. Other aliens stopped to stare as they passed. David could hear the clicking conversations that followed their group and see the pointing gestures directed his way. Word was already spreading that something unusual had been brought to the fortress. David had the uncomfortable feeling that he was about to become the center of attention in ways he would not enjoy. The corridors opened into a vast chamber filled with armed warriors. At the far end, seated on what could only be described as a throne, was the largest alien David had yet seen. This one's natural armor was decorated with precious metals and gems, and the other aliens showed it obvious deference. When David's escort approached the throne, they made elaborate gestures that were clearly some form of salute. The alien ruler looked down at David with obvious interest and made a series of sounds that echoed through the chamber. Whatever it had said caused laughter among the assembled warriors. David did not need a translator to understand that he was being discussed as a curiosity, rather than a threat. His real test was about to begin. War Commander Gecht raised one of his forearms and the great hall fell silent. David stood in the center of the massive chamber while hundreds of Thakari warriors stared down at him from carved stone galleries that rose in tiers toward the vaulted ceiling. The air hummed with anticipation and barely contained amusement. Gecht clicked his mandibles in what David was beginning to recognize as their equivalent of laughter. The war commander gestured toward David with a theatrical flourish and launched into what was obviously a speech for the benefit of his audience. Though David could not understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. He was being presented as entertainment. The assembled warriors responded with waves of clicking sounds that filled the chamber like the buzz of enormous insects. Many pointed at David with their various arms, clearly commenting on his appearance. Compared to their imposing 8-foot frames and natural armor, David knew he must look small and vulnerable. His torn uniform and visible injuries only added to the impression of weakness. From a side entrance, another Thakari approached the throne. This one was older, with armor that had dulled to a deep gray and movements that spoke of great age and wisdom. The crowd quieted as Elder Vrax made his way slowly to stand before Gecht. The two aliens engaged in a brief clicking conversation. Before Vrax turned his multifaceted eyes toward David, Vrax studied David with scientific curiosity rather than mockery. He walked in a slow circle around the human, occasionally stopping to examine details of David's equipment or physical structure. David remained still, understanding that any sudden movement might be interpreted as aggression. The elder's examination was thorough and professional. He seemed particularly interested in David's hands, manipulating the fingers to test their flexibility and range of motion. David's binocular vision also fascinated him, and he spent considerable time positioning his own head at various angles as if trying to understand how such limited visual perception could be useful. When Vrax completed his inspection, he returned to Gecht and made a report in their clicking language. David caught what might have been numbers and technical terms. suggesting that Vrax was providing some kind of analysis of human capabilities. The war commander listened with interest, but his final response prompted more laughter from the assembled warriors. A younger Thakari warrior jumped down from the galleries to land heavily on the chamber floor. This one's armor was decorated with what looked like battle honors, and his movements had the confidence of proven combat experience. He pointed at David and made challenging sounds while flexing his forearms in an obvious display of strength. The challenge was taken up by others. Soon a dozen warriors had descended to the main floor, each one demonstrating their physical prowess for David's benefit. They lifted massive stone blocks, bent metal bars with their bare hands, and engaged in brief wrestling matches that shook the floor beneath David's feet. Throughout this display, David maintained his composure and continued his own observations. The Thakari were indeed physically powerful, but their demonstrations revealed important information about their society and military structure. They valued individual strength and personal combat ability above all else. Their weapons were designed for close-quarters fighting, and their armor prioritized protection over mobility. More importantly, David noticed patterns in their behavior that suggested rigid, hierarchical thinking. Junior warriors deferred to senior ones without question, and all of them showed automatic obedience to Gekt and Vrax. This kind of strict chain of command could be both a strength and a weakness, depending on circumstances. When the demonstrations ended, Gekt gestured for David to step forward. The war commander said something that caused expectant silence throughout the chamber. David understood that he was being invited, or perhaps commanded, to demonstrate his own capabilities in return. David looked around the chamber and made a decision that would either earn him respect or get him killed. He held up his hands in a gesture that he hoped would be interpreted as a request for patience, then pointed to various objects scattered around the chamber. Broken weapons, discarded armor pieces, and decorative items that had clearly seen better days. He moved slowly toward a pile of debris in one corner, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The warriors watched with interest as David began sorting through the materials, selecting pieces of metal, lengths of rope, and what looked like components from damaged equipment. David had always been good with his hands. His training in the Colonial Marines had included extensive instruction in field engineering and improvised construction techniques. On Earth, these skills were considered basic survival knowledge. Here, they might be his salvation. Working under the watchful eyes of hundreds of alien warriors, David began to construct something from the available materials. His first creation was simple but effective, a compound pulley system that multiplied the force applied to lifting heavy objects. When he demonstrated its effectiveness by single-handedly raising a stone block that had required 3 warriors to move, the chamber fell silent. The silence stretched as David continued working. His next project was more ambitious, a crossbow, constructed from salvaged metal and rope, with a trigger mechanism improvised from broken armor components. The weapon was crude but functional, and David demonstrated its accuracy by hitting targets across the chamber with improvised bolts, but it was his third creation that truly captured their attention. Using chemical knowledge from his military training, David had identified several substances among the debris that could be combined to create explosive charges. The demonstration blast, carefully controlled and directed away from the audience, left a crater in the stone floor and ringing echoes in everyone's ears. The Thakari warriors looked at each other with expressions that David was learning to interpret as surprise and confusion. Here was a creature that appeared physically weak but could create tools and weapons from nothing more than discarded materials. More disturbing, perhaps, was the realization that these creations represented thinking patterns completely alien to their own approach to problems. Gekt descended from his throne to examine David's constructions more closely. He tested the pulley system himself, lifted the crossbow to study its mechanism, and spent long minutes staring at the crater left by the explosive charge. When he looked back at David, the mockery was gone from his multifaceted eyes. Elder Vrax approached and began what sounded like an interrogation. Though David could not understand the specific questions, It was clear that Vrax wanted to know more about human capabilities and technology. David responded with gestures and simple demonstrations, trying to convey information without revealing too much about Earth's actual technological level. The mood in the chamber had shifted from entertainment to serious interest. Warriors who had been laughing at David's appearance now studied him with the attention they might give to a new weapon or military tactic. Some of the younger ones attempted to recreate his constructions with limited success, lacking both the knowledge and the manual dexterity required. As the impromptu engineering lesson continued, David became aware that he had achieved something important. He was no longer seen as a helpless curiosity, but as something potentially valuable. The question now was whether that change in status would improve his situation or make it more dangerous. The answer came when Gecht made a proclamation that caused excited clicking throughout the chamber. Though David could not understand the words, the result was clear. Instead of being returned to whatever holding cell they had prepared for him, David found himself assigned quarters that, while still clearly a prison, were considerably more comfortable than he had expected. As guards escorted him through corridors lined with curious faces, David reflected on what he had accomplished. He had bought himself time and possibly even earned a measure of respect. But he also understood that he had raised questions that these aliens would demand answers to. His real challenges were just beginning. 3 days had passed since David's engineering demonstration in the Great Hall, and his status among the Thakari had continued to evolve in unexpected ways. His quarters, while still secured, now included access to a workshop area where curious warriors brought him broken equipment and challenging construction problems. Word of the humans' unusual abilities had spread throughout the fortress, and David found himself treated more like a valued consultant than a prisoner. The morning brought an unexpected visitor. A young Thakari warrior named Crix entered David's workshop with obvious excitement. Unlike the older warriors, Crix seemed fascinated rather than threatened by David's different approach to problem solving. He had been observing David's work for days and had even attempted to recreate some of the simpler constructions with limited success. Crix carried with him a collection of metal pieces and components that David recognized as parts from Thakari weapons and armor. Through a combination of gestures and simple drawings, Crix explained that he and several other young warriors were facing a challenge that their traditional training had not prepared them for. They needed to breach a heavily fortified position during upcoming war exercises, but their standard frontal assault tactics had failed repeatedly. David studied the materials and listened carefully to Crix's explanation of the problem. The young warrior's enthusiasm was infectious, and David found himself genuinely interested in helping solve this tactical puzzle. More importantly, he realized that this request represented an opportunity to demonstrate human military thinking. On a larger scale. Working together, David and Crix began constructing what David explained as a portable breach charge. The device combined explosive materials with a shaped metal liner that would focus the blast energy in a specific direction. The principles were basic military engineering, but the application required careful attention to safety and timing. As they worked, other young warriors gathered to observe. David found himself teaching not just construction techniques but fundamental concepts of physics and chemistry that the Thakari had never considered. Their education focused on individual combat skills and personal strength, leaving them unprepared for the kind of systematic thinking that human military doctrine took for granted. The completed breach charge was tested against a section of fortress wall that had been designated for repairs anyway. The explosion carved a neat hole through solid stone, demonstrating both the effectiveness of the device and the precision with which it could be applied. The young warriors were amazed, but David could see that they were beginning to understand something more important than the weapon itself. Word of the successful test reached War Commander Gecht within hours. David was summoned to a private meeting with the fortress commander, accompanied by Elder Vrax and several senior military advisors. The tone of this meeting was completely different from his earlier public presentation. These aliens were asking serious questions about human military capabilities and philosophy, Gecht presented. David with detailed maps and tactical information about an ongoing conflict that had stalemated the Thakari forces for months. Their enemy, the Corvan Federation, had established defensive positions that seemed impregnable to traditional Thakari assault tactics. Wave after wave of warriors had thrown themselves against Corvan fortifications with minimal success and massive casualties. David studied the tactical situation with professional interest. The Thakari approach to warfare was exactly what he had expected based on his observations of their culture. They relied on the individual prowess of their warriors and preferred direct confrontation to complex maneuvering. Against an enemy with equivalent technology and strong defensive positions, this approach was proving inadequate. The maps revealed terrain, features, and enemy positions that offered numerous opportunities for the kind of combined arms tactics that human forces would employ almost automatically. David began sketching alternative approaches, using symbols and diagrams to communicate concepts that had no direct equivalent in Thakari military thinking. His first suggestion involved coordinated attacks from multiple directions using smaller forces to create diversions while the main assault targeted weak points in the enemy defensive line. The Thakari officers listened with interest but seemed puzzled by the complexity of the plan. Their traditional approach favored concentrated force applied at the strongest point of enemy resistance, believing that victory came from overwhelming individual opposition. David's second proposal introduced the concept of artillery preparation. Rather than simply charging enemy positions, he suggested using long-range weapons to suppress defensive fire before the assault began. The Thakari had such weapons but used them primarily for siege work against static targets. The idea of mobile artillery support was revolutionary to them, but it was David's third suggestion that truly captured their attention. He proposed using deception and misdirection to make the enemy commit their reserves to defending positions that would not actually be attacked. The main assault would then fall on weakened sections of the defensive line, achieving breakthrough at minimal cost. Elder Vrax was the first to grasp the implications of David's tactical thinking. Through careful questioning and David's patient explanations, the old warrior began to understand that human military doctrine was based on efficiency rather than individual heroism. Humans sought to win battles with minimal casualties by applying superior thinking rather than superior strength. The discussion continued for hours as David outlined additional concepts: coordinated communication between units, flexible command structures that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions, and the use of terrain and weather as tactical advantages rather than obstacles to overcome. Each idea challenged fundamental assumptions about how wars should be fought. Gecht finally called for a practical demonstration. A section of the fortress was designated as a mock battlefield, with volunteer warriors playing the role of entrenched defenders. David was given command of an attacking force and permission to implement his tactical suggestions within the constraints of a training exercise. The result was unlike anything the Thakari had ever witnessed. David's forces approached the defensive position from multiple directions, using suppressing fire and diversionary attacks to confuse the defenders about the main threat. When the final assault came, it struck at the weakest point in the defensive line with overwhelming local superiority, achieving complete victory in minutes rather than the hours or days that traditional Thakari tactics would have required. The implications were not lost on the observing officers. Here was a way of thinking about warfare that could transform Thakari military effectiveness without requiring new technology or major changes to their existing force structure. It simply required abandoning the cultural emphasis on individual combat prowess in favor of collective tactical intelligence, but David's demonstration raised as many questions as it answered. If humans possessed such advanced military thinking, what did that say about their civilization as a whole? How many humans were there, and what were their intentions regarding other species? Most importantly, could this tactical knowledge be learned and applied by Thakari forces, or was it somehow dependent on uniquely human characteristics? These questions would need answers, and Gecht made it clear that David would be expected to provide them. The war commander's attitude toward his human prisoner had evolved from casual curiosity to serious professional interest. David had proven that he possessed knowledge that could determine the outcome of interstellar conflicts. As guards escorted David back to his quarters, he reflected on what he had accomplished and what it might cost him. He had demonstrated human military superiority in a way that commanded respect rather than fear, but he had also revealed information that could be used against Earth if these aliens ever encountered human forces in actual combat. The line between helpful cooperation and dangerous betrayal was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. That night, as David lay in his comfortable prison, he could hear the sounds of increased activity throughout the fortress. Messages were being sent, supplies were being moved, and units were being reorganized according to new tactical principles. His ideas were already being implemented on a scale that would determine the fate of thousands of warriors. David had wanted to prove human worth to his captors, but he was beginning to realize that he might have succeeded too well. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and harder questions. The easy part was over. The victory reports arrived at dawn. David was eating his morning meal when Crix burst into his quarters with excitement radiating from every gesture. The young warrior carried a stack of message crystals and began playing them in rapid succession, filling the room with the clicking sounds of Thakari military communications. David did not need translation to understand the significance of what he was hearing. The tone of the reports, the obvious excitement in the voices, and Crix's enthusiastic reactions all told the same story. The tactical principles David had taught were working beyond anyone's expectations. War Commander Gecht arrived shortly afterward, with Elder Vrax and a full escort of senior officers. The fortress commander's attitude had changed dramatically since their last meeting. Where before there had been cautious interest, now there was something approaching reverence mixed with barely controlled excitement through Crix, who was developing surprising skill as a translator. Gecht explained what had happened. The Thakari forces had implemented David's tactical suggestions in 3 separate engagements against Corvan positions. All 3 attacks had succeeded with minimal casualties, achieving in hours what months of traditional assault tactics had failed to accomplish. The breakthrough had been complete. Corvan forces, accustomed to repelling frontal attacks by superior Thakari warriors, had been unprepared for coordinated multi-directional assaults supported by precise artillery fire. Their defensive positions, designed to channel attackers into killing zones, became death traps when the Thakari approached from unexpected directions. More importantly, the psychological impact on both sides had been profound. Corvan commanders were reportedly in confusion, unable to understand how their previously successful defensive strategies had become worthless overnight. Thakari morale, conversely, had soared as warriors discovered that intelligent tactics could achieve victory without the massive casualties they had come to accept as inevitable. David listened to these reports with mixed emotions. Professional pride in seeing his tactical principles vindicated was tempered by the knowledge that he had just helped one alien species gain military advantage over another. The ethical implications were troubling, but he pushed those concerns aside to focus on more immediate issues. Gecht was asking new questions now, and these were the ones David had been dreading. The war commander wanted to know about human civilization, military capabilities, and territorial extent. David's tactical knowledge had proven so valuable that Gecht needed to understand whether humanity represented a potential ally or an existential threat to Thakari expansion. David chose his words carefully, using Crix as both translator and buffer for concepts that might be misunderstood. He explained that humans were explorers and colonists rather than conquerors, preferring to settle uninhabited worlds rather than displace existing populations. This was technically true, though David omitted mention of the various conflicts that had driven human expansion beyond Earth. When pressed about human military strength, David described a civilization that had learned to wage war efficiently out of necessity rather than preference. He spoke of weapons that could destroy entire cities, of fleets that could travel between stars, and of tactical doctrine refined through centuries of conflict. But he presented these capabilities as defensive measures rather than tools of aggression. The response from his audience was telling. Rather than showing fear or hostility, the Thakari officers displayed the kind of professional respect that warriors reserve for worthy opponents. In their culture, military prowess was the highest virtue, and David's description of human capabilities elevated his species in their estimation rather than marking them as enemies. Elder Vrax asked the most perceptive questions. He wanted to understand how humans had developed such advanced tactical thinking and whether it could be taught to other species. David found himself explaining concepts of military academies, staff colleges, and the systematic study of warfare that human civilization took for granted. The old warrior grasped the implications immediately. Human military effectiveness was not based on individual brilliance, but on institutional knowledge accumulated over generations. This suggested a level of civilizational sophistication that impressed the Thakari even more than David's tactical innovations. As the meeting progressed, David realized that he was participating in something unprecedented. These aliens were not simply extracting information from a prisoner, but engaging in what could only be described as diplomatic negotiations. Gek's questions about trade possibilities, territorial boundaries, and mutual defense agreements made it clear that the Thakari were considering formal relations with humanity. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger with urgent news. The clicking sounds of rapid communication filled the room as the newcomer delivered what was obviously a report of great importance. David watched the faces of his audience change from professional interest to amazement and then to something approaching awe. Cricks translated with obvious excitement. Word of the Thakari victories had reached the highest levels of their government. Overlord Dex himself, supreme commander of the entire Thakari Empire, was coming to Fortress Valdris to meet the alien who had revolutionized their military doctrine. The implications were staggering. Overlord Dex was described as a figure of legendary status among the Thakari, a warrior who had conquered entire star systems through personal combat prowess and strategic brilliance. His decision to personally investigate David's contributions meant that human tactical knowledge had attracted attention at the highest levels of Thakari civilization. Gekt immediately began preparations for the Overlord's visit. The fortress was transformed as warriors worked around the clock to prepare suitable accommodations and ceremonial arrangements. David found himself moved to more luxurious quarters and provided with clothing appropriate for meeting Thakari royalty, but the preparations also included security measures that made David's status clear. Despite the respect he had earned, he was still a prisoner whose knowledge was too valuable to risk losing. Guards were doubled and his movements were restricted to essential areas of the fortress. During the 3 days of preparation, David continued his tactical consultations with Thakari officers. The success of his initial suggestions had generated dozens of new questions about military doctrine, logistics, and strategic planning. Each conversation revealed more about Thakari civilization while providing David with insights into their strengths and weaknesses. He learned that the Thakari Empire controlled 12 star systems and was in the process of expanding into areas controlled by various other species. Their approach to interstellar relations was primarily military, with diplomacy serving mainly to formalize the results of successful conquests. This aggressive expansion had made them enemies of most neighboring civilizations. David also discovered that Thakari technology, while impressive in many areas, was focused primarily on individual enhancement rather than collective capabilities. Their warriors were equipped with advanced armor and weapons, but their tactical communication systems and coordination methods were primitive by human standards. This technological profile fit perfectly with their cultural emphasis on individual prowess over collective action. It also suggested opportunities for human influence that went far beyond simple tactical advice. If the Thakari could be convinced to adopt human approaches to communication, logistics, and strategic planning, their military effectiveness could be increased by orders of magnitude. The night before Overlord Dex's arrival, David lay awake considering his situation. He had successfully demonstrated human value to his captors and earned a level of respect that ensured his survival. But he had also created expectations that might be impossible to fulfill and revealed information that could potentially be used against human interests. More troubling was the realization that he was becoming complicit in Thakari military expansion. His tactical advice was helping them conquer other species and expand their empire. The ethical implications of this collaboration were becoming harder to ignore, yet David also saw unprecedented opportunities. If he could influence Thakari's strategic thinking at the highest levels, he might be able to moderate their aggressive expansion and promote more peaceful approaches to interstellar relations. The arrival of Overlord Dex would determine whether such influence was possible. As dawn approached, David could hear the sounds of arriving ships and the movements of large military formations. The most powerful figure in Thakari civilization was coming to meet a human prisoner whose knowledge had changed the course of an interstellar war. The next few hours would determine not only David's fate, but potentially the future relationship between two vastly different civilizations. The real test was about to begin. The massive ship blotted out the morning sun as it descended toward Fortress Valdris. David watched from his quarters as the vessel, larger than anything he had seen in the Thakari fleet, settled onto the main landing platform with surprising grace. The hull was decorated with battle honors and precious metals that caught the light like scattered stars. Marking it as the flagship of an empire, Overlord Dex emerged from the ship surrounded by an honor guard, whose armor surpassed even that of Gek's elite warriors. But it was the Overlord himself who commanded attention. Even among the tall Thakari, Dex was a giant, standing nearly 10 feet in height with natural armor that had been enhanced with technological augmentations. Battle scars covered his visible surfaces like a history written in violence, and his movements carried the confidence of absolute authority. David was escorted to the Great Hall, which had been transformed for this unprecedented meeting. Banners displaying Thakari military honors hung from the walls, and hundreds of warriors filled the galleries to witness their supreme leader's encounter with the alien strategist. The air hummed with anticipation and barely controlled excitement. Overlord Dex took his place on a throne that had been specially prepared for his visit, a massive construction of metal and stone that elevated him above everyone else in the chamber. His multifaceted eyes fixed on David with an intensity that was almost physical, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Crix, who had been designated as David's translator for this crucial meeting, conveyed the Overlord's first words. They were not questions, but statements of fact, delivered with the confidence of absolute certainty. Vex had studied the reports of David's tactical innovations and their battlefield results. He had consulted with his finest military advisors and reviewed detailed analyses of the new strategies. His conclusion was simple: human military thinking represented an evolutionary advancement that the Thakari had been seeking for generations. David listened carefully as Crix translated the Overlord's assessment of human capabilities. Vex had grasped something that even David had not fully appreciated. The tactical principles that David considered basic military knowledge represented a fundamental shift in how warfare could be conducted. They offered the possibility of achieving strategic objectives with minimal casualties and maximum efficiency, concepts that challenged everything the Thakari thought they knew about conflict. But Overlord Dex wanted more than tactical advice. Through carefully phrased questions, he probed David's knowledge of human civilization, technology, and strategic thinking. The Overlord was not simply interested in winning individual battles, but in understanding how humans approached the larger questions of interstellar expansion and empire building. David found himself describing human history in terms that the Thakari could understand. He spoke of Earth as a world where numerous civilizations had competed for resources and territory, developing increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare out of necessity. He described the nuclear age and the realization that military technology had reached a point where victory and mutual destruction had become synonymous. The turning point in David's presentation came when he explained how humanity had chosen cooperation over continued conflict. Rather than destroying themselves with weapons of ultimate power, humans had learned to channel their competitive instincts toward exploration and expansion beyond Earth. Military technology had been transformed into tools for defending colonies and exploring dangerous frontiers. Overlord Dex listened to this account with obvious fascination. In David's description of human development, he recognized a path that the Thakari themselves might follow. Their own military prowess had reached a point of diminishing returns, where additional conquests required increasingly costly campaigns against better-prepared enemies. Human strategic thinking offered a way to maximize gains, while minimizing risks. The formal demonstration began when Dex commanded that tactical scenarios be presented for David's analysis. Holographic displays showed complex battlefield situations, drawn from actual Thakari military campaigns, some successful and others that had ended in costly stalemates or defeats. David was invited to suggest how human tactical principles might have changed the outcomes. Working through these scenarios, David revealed the depth of human military thinking. Each situation was approached systematically with careful analysis of terrain, enemy capabilities, available resources, and strategic objectives. David's solutions often involved approaches that the Thakari had never considered, using deception, misdirection, and coordinated operations to achieve results that brute force had failed to accomplish. But it was David's analysis of failed campaigns that truly impressed his audience. He identified the strategic errors that had led to Thakari defeats, explaining how different approaches might have turned disasters into victories. His critiques were delivered with the professional objectivity of someone who understood that learning from failure was more valuable than celebrating success. Overlord Dex was particularly interested in David's discussion of strategic restraint. The concept that military power could be more effective when used sparingly, as a tool for achieving political objectives rather than an end in itself, was revolutionary to Thakari thinking. David explained how humans had learned that conquered enemies could become valuable allies if treated with intelligence rather than brutality. The climactic moment came when David was asked to address the strategic situation of the Thakari Empire itself. Overlord Dex presented a holographic map showing the 12 star systems under Thakari control and the territories of neighboring civilizations. The display revealed a complex web of conflicts, alliances, and territorial disputes that stretched across hundreds of light years. David studied the strategic picture with professional interest. The Thakari Empire was surrounded by enemies who had been driven to cooperation by the threat of Thakari expansion. Traditional military thinking would suggest that the empire was in a strong position, controlling resource-rich systems and maintaining superior military forces. But David saw something different. He pointed out that the Thakari were facing a classic strategic problem. Their aggressive expansion had created a coalition of enemies who were learning to coordinate their efforts against the common threat. Continued military pressure would only strengthen these alliances and eventually lead to a war of attrition that the empire could not win. Regardless of individual battle outcomes, David's alternative vision was breathtaking in its scope. Instead of continued conquest, he suggested that the Thakari could use their military superiority to establish themselves as protectors and arbitrators in regional conflicts. Rather than absorbing territory directly, they could create a network of allied systems that benefited from Thakari protection while maintaining their independence. This approach would require fundamental changes in Thakari thinking about victory and success. Instead of measuring achievement by conquered territory, they would need to evaluate their strategic position by the stability and prosperity of their sphere of influence. Military action would become a tool for maintaining balance rather than expanding boundaries. Overlord Dex listened to this strategic analysis with growing amazement. David was describing a form of empire that Thakari had never imagined, one based on voluntary cooperation rather than forced submission. The implications were staggering, suggesting possibilities for expansion and influence that traditional conquest could never achieve. But the most profound moment came when David addressed the question of human intentions. Overlord Thex wanted to know whether humanity represented a threat to Thakari expansion or a potential partner in achieving strategic objectives. David's answer would determine not only his own fate, but the future relationship between two interstellar civilizations. David chose his words with extraordinary care. He explained that humans were primarily concerned with establishing secure colonies and developing peaceful trade relationships. Conflict was not their preference, but they had proven willing and able to defend themselves when threatened. More importantly, humans had learned to value diversity and were interested in learning from other civilizations rather than conquering them. He suggested that human and Thakari civilizations could benefit from formal cooperation. Human tactical knowledge could enhance Thakari military effectiveness, while Thakari technology and resources could support human expansion into new regions of space. Both species could achieve their strategic objectives more efficiently through partnership than through conflict. The silence that followed David's presentation stretched for long minutes. Overlord Thex sat motionless on his throne, considering implications that would reshape the fundamental assumptions of Thakari civilization. Around the chamber, warriors who had built their lives around concepts of conquest and dominance struggled to understand alternatives they had never imagined. When Nex finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. Through Crix's translation, David learned that the Overlord had made a decision that would echo through Thakari history. He declared that David's strategic wisdom represented the evolution that Thakari civilization needed to achieve its true potential. What happened next was unprecedented in Thakari culture. Overlord Thex rose from his throne and descended to the main floor of the chamber. The assembled warriors watched in stunned silence as their supreme leader approached David directly, without the ceremonial barriers that normally separated rulers from subjects. Standing before David, Overlord Thex performed a ritual that Crix could barely translate because it had never been used in this context before. The Oath of Strategic Submission was an ancient ceremony reserved for acknowledging military genius, so profound that it transcended normal hierarchies. By performing this ritual, Thex was publicly declaring that David's strategic thinking represented authority that even the overlord of the Thakari Empire would defer to. The oath itself was simple but revolutionary. Thex swore to honor David's strategic wisdom and to implement the principles he had taught throughout the Thakari military. More importantly, he designated David as supreme tactical advisor to the Empire, with authority to reshape Thakari military doctrine according to human strategic principles. But David's response was equally unprecedented. Rather than simply accepting the honor, he imposed conditions that would fundamentally change Thakari society. He demanded the abolition of slavery within the empire, the establishment of diplomatic protocols for dealing with other species, and the commitment to use military power primarily for defensive purposes rather than aggressive expansion. These conditions challenged core assumptions of Thakari civilization, but Overlord Thex accepted them without hesitation. He had recognized that David's strategic vision offered possibilities for power and influence that traditional conquest could never achieve. The transformation would be difficult, but the potential rewards justified any sacrifice. The ceremony concluded with David's formal acceptance of his new role, but his final action revealed the true scope of his planning. Using equipment that Crix had helped him construct in secret, David activated a subspace communication device that had been hidden among his workshop materials. The signal that emerged was encrypted using protocols that only human intelligence services would recognize. As the transmission propagated through space toward the distant Sol system, David explained to his amazed audience that he was informing Earth of these developments and requesting formal diplomatic contact with the Thakari Empire. First contact between humanity and an alien civilization would no longer be a matter of chance encounter, but of deliberate diplomatic initiative. Overlord Thex watched this demonstration of foresight and planning with obvious approval. David had not only provided tactical knowledge, but had orchestrated events to create the strategic outcome he desired. This level of long-term thinking impressed the Thakari leader even more than the battlefield innovations that had brought them together. In the days that followed, David worked with Thakari officials to establish the framework for interstellar diplomacy. His role had evolved from prisoner to advisor to architect of a new form of interstellar relations. The human who had been mocked as a weak curiosity had become the catalyst for transforming two civilizations. The last entry in David's personal log, transmitted to Earth along with his diplomatic reports, captured the magnitude of what had been achieved. He had proven that human intelligence and strategic thinking could earn respect and influence among alien civilizations. More importantly, he had demonstrated that cooperation could accomplish more than conflict, establishing principles that would guide human expansion among the stars for generations to come. The captive who had been laughed at had indeed changed everything, not through force or threats, but through the patient application of human wisdom to problems that had seemed unsolvable. In earning the fealty of an alien empire, David had opened possibilities for human civilization that no one had dared to imagine.